Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Alyssa Muscatine, and we're delighted to have with us this evening lawyer turned journalist and author, Dahlia Lithwick, here to talk about her new book, Lady Justice, Women, the Law, and the Battle to Save America. If you follow Dahlia's work, you know she's one of the most highly regarded legal analysts writing and speaking today. She's the senior legal correspondent at Slate, which she started writing for more than 20 years ago after graduating from law school and working for a bit for a family law firm. And she hosts Amicus, a biweekly podcast about the law. Her articles have appeared in a number of prominent publications, and she's received several awards, including a National Magazine Award. You probably also have seen her on TV, where she frequently appears as a commentator. In Lady Justice, Dahlia looks back at the year 2016 as a sort of high watermark for women and the legal system in America. That's when the Supreme Court, in Women's Health versus Hellerstedt, struck down an attempt by Texas to place restrictions on the delivery of abortion services, saying the restrictions created an undue burden for women seeking abortions. Then Donald Trump got elected, and it appeared that whatever progress women had been making began unraveling, a trend underscored just last June by the overturning of Roe v. Wade and Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. What Dahlia describes in her book is a series of efforts by women lawyers in recent years that constitute a kind of resistance movement. These are women who, Dahlia writes, were galvanized around the time of Trump's election and have mobilized in one way or another to counter threats to the rule of law and protect their and our constitutional rights. Examples include, Sally Yates, Roberta Kaplan, Stacey Abrams. You'll hear about them and others, I'm sure, in a minute. Combining narrative profiles of these women with insightful analysis, Dahlia highlights the heroic work of these women to save American democracy and also makes clear the extent of challenges remaining. Kirkus, in their review, called the book required reading for this post-Dobbs world, and Publishers Weekly said this evocative study captures the power and fragility of the rule of law. Dahlia will be in conversation with Michele Goodwin, who's here in glorious pink. She's a law professor and frequent public commentator herself. She's on the faculty at the University of California, Irvine, and currently is a visiting professor here at Georgetown. She also hosts the popular podcast On the Issues with Michele Goodwin at Ms. Magazine. And she's written a number of books, one of which, Policing the Womb, we happen to have in stock. Just happen to have it. Good go. So please join me in welcoming Dahlia Lithwick and Michele Goodwin.
Dahlia, it is always.
Are we using these mics?
We're using these. Okay.
We're double mic'd.
We're double mic'd. Oh, there we are.
There we are.
There we are. Well, it's a pleasure, as always, to be with you.
There is no one that I would rather. This is my first book event, and I think possibly my first public event in 2.5 years. It's crazy. And I know my basement very well. But it is really you should read Michele's book before you read my book, in no small measure because Michele has been predicting where we are for a lot longer than I cottoned onto it. So there is no one I'd rather be with.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Here's toast.
Yeah,
There we go. All right. And I think that maybe one of the last public events that you were at was in California.
Yes,
with me.
with you.
With me, right? For days before
Yep.
everything just closed down. So it's great being with you. And what a powerful and important book, Lady Justice, Women, the Law, and the Battle to Save America. So let's dive in. So you start off with talking about Paulie Murray early in the book And many people don't know about Paulie Murray, and you do such a beautiful job in paying tribute and homage to her and her legacy, or they and their legacy. Tell us about Paulie Murray and why it is that Paulie is front and center in the discussion about Lady Justice.
I mean, I would start by saying anybody in this room who went to law school, I would be surprised if you learned about Paulie Murray, but I certainly did not. And I learned about Paulie Murray through the writing of some friends, some of whom are in this room. And I learned about Paulie Murray through the writing principally of Black women who were trying to say that while we were obsessed to near derangement with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in many, many ways, Paulie Murray had done much of the groundwork, the spade work on both gender and racial equality in the 14th Amendment, even before Ruth Bader Ginsburg came on the scene.
Before she was in law school.
Before she was in law school. To her immense credit, let's just say that Ginsburg credited
She did.
Paulie Murray.
On video.
On video, but also on, you know,
In a famous brief.
In a famous brief, and as though she were co-counsel. So Paulie Murray, for me, becomes very emblematic of some of the questions that are shot through this book about who gets credit and who gets famous, who does the work, and who is, you know, recognized for the work. Frequently, those things map onto Black women and white women historically. So I just became really, really obsessed with the idea that someone who had desegregated lunch counters before anyone else, who had refused to go to the back of the bus long before Rosa Parks, who had written for a law school paper what became the
Her second year of law school.
Her second year of law school, that which becomes the spine of Brown v. Board, except no one tells her that her work has been lifted and repurposed for briefing in Brown v. Board. She finds out after that her own work had been used. And so for me, I think it becomes a symbol both of, you know, these questions around who do we slavishly obsess about and think are our heroes, but more deeply, I think the way women do the work.
Yes.
Because women frequently, and some of these women in the book are not famous, just do the work, and they don't always get credited, and they often work in huge groups, and history sometimes forgets them. And so for me, that becomes a theme throughout the book because, and maybe I should have started here, this book in some ways is trying to fit into the huge RBG-shaped hole in our sort of imaginative lives. We miss her, we long for her, we're waiting for the second coming. And I think...
Coming through that door.
Coming through the door.
Yes.
And I think, you know, with all due respect to RBG, who was extraordinary, there are what I think of as sort of Ruth Baby Ginsburgs all around us every day doing the work, and we have to stop longing for that which is gone and really lift up that which is all around.
The Ruth Baby Ginsburgs and the Ruth Mama Ginsburgs, right? When we think about Paulie Murray, who wrote a book that, as you talk about here, that Thurgood Marshall said was the Bible of the civil rights movement, her book on race laws.
Yep.
I mean, really tremendous. So definitely worth finding out more about Paulie Murray and her incredible legacy. So I want to take us back. I want to take us back to first what inspired you to become a journalist, because you went to law school and you went into practice. So what was the transition?
The answer to that question is if you definitely want to leave the law, you should do divorce law in Reno. So after I left my law firm, my clerkship, I clerked on the Ninth Circuit, and I left my clerkship, and I this is the part of the story where I copped to having like a teeny little gambling addiction after clerking in Reno, and I loved Reno and I wanted to stay there, and the boom legal industry is in fact divorce law. So I did a couple of years at a firm there, and I was so deeply unhappy because we were just fighting over the Tupperware day in and day out. And so I, with all due respect to
Tupperware and matchmaking
Matrimony,
and matrimony.
they're great people. It just wasn't a good fit for me. And so then I and you know, if Jack Schaefer's in the room, he can tell the story better than me, but I sort of stumbled into covering the Microsoft trial for Slate. I don't think anyone thought I was sticking around. I kept begging them to like tell me if I was covering it the next week because I'd buy a second suit. And so I was just incredibly lucky to be at the right place, at the right time, at the right magazine. And maybe the last thing I'd say on this is that because I didn't understand the Microsoft trial, I had not taken antitrust, I didn't understand what an operating system was. I just went into that trial and did comedy, like day after day, just wrote jokes. Jack's nodding because he had to edit me. And so I think that was essentially my entree. And this is not, I want to be really careful because I think women sometimes tell their origin stories as though everything is sort of hapless, like stumbling around and like slipping in goo. And it wasn't entirely slipping in goo. There was a lot of slipping in goo, but I think I was just very, very lucky that I landed at an internet magazine when internet magazines were new, but also at a magazine that really kind of let me cover the law the way I wanted to and didn't in any way try to clip my wings.
Well, I wanted to ask that question because I want to go more recent and then fill in that space. In the book, you talk about how you loved what you did at the court, but how you quit the court. And we're going to, go back, but that really resonated with me, how you divorced yourself from the court after being part of, as we talked about on the podcast, the folks that were covering the court were a lot of really impactful women. And maybe you can talk about what that experience was, but then what led you to say, okay, I'm done with the court in the way in which you had been doing your work previously.
I mean, I think the short answer is that I sat through the Brett Kavanaugh hearings. I was in the room when Christine Blasey Ford testified. I didn't think that there was a process, much less a fair process. I think that, and I think I said this to Michele on her podcast, when Judge Kavanaugh started shouting and smashing the table and kind of threatening Senator Klobuchar, some of the women sitting in the room, the women reporters, it was not a big room, and you could see their shoulders coming up around their ears. There was just a real feeling of, for me at least, that it was beyond just a story, that there was some sense of menace, and I'm even going to say the word violence, and that it was very difficult, having sat through that, to kind of go through the quick step normalization. Now he's been confirmed. We're going to say that there was a investigation. There wasn't. And now we're all going to just call him Justice Kavanaugh and treat him as though he is Justice Kennedy. And for me, partly because I felt as though, and this is a through line in not just the book, but the work I've done at Slate on Me Too and due process. You can't have a fake process, pretend it's a process, and then normalize it, because then you are in fact complicit in that process. And so for months and months, and Mark Stern, my colleague, is here, and he will tell you, I just said I had a cold and I can't go to the court, and like I tripped and I can't go to the court. And after about a year, I think, of just saying I was covering something, my editor said, what's going on? And I said, I think I'm allergic to normalizing that. And again, with huge credit to my colleagues who go in and still do it, I just felt that to just sit there and pretend that what had happened had been legitimate would make me complicit in something that I felt wrong about. And I think that I probably over-identified with Christine Blasey Ford for reasons we can talk about or not. But it seemed to me that this act of simply stepping over her, of turning to her and saying, oh, I believe you, we all believe you, Chuck Grassley believed her, but sorry, just felt like perpetrating such a deep act of violence upon her. And then I guess just to land where you started, when Dobbs comes down, and Justice Gorsuch is one of the people who is happily involved in ending Roe v. Wade, it felt as though that entire system of being complicit in acting as though this was a normal court
Right.
fell apart for everyone else.
Right. Alito, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett, the whole. Well, you said, and I want to get to the book, but you just opened a door, so I'm just gonna just put the shoe in there a little bit.
Come into my therapy room.
But that Christine Blasey Ford, Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, that there was something that resonated for you in her telling her story. And I'd have to say that around the country, that seemed to be the case. There were women who flew to Washington, D.C. I had students coming to my office in tears, shaking, just watching those hearings and being traumatized, though the word that they were using was trauma and violence. So you're not alone in that. But what was the way in which you related to her and what she was saying to Congress, to the Senate?
I mean, I think there's a couple of things. One is, and there's material in the book about, my coming forward and talking about a judge on the Ninth Circuit, Alex Kaczynski, who there had been allegations about his conduct, and I waited a very, very long time until I reported what I knew in a public fashion. And so I had already a deep sense, Michele, that of complicity and of what it is to keep secrets and what it is to hold on to something for decades, because the power structures that exist demand that.
They demand that of women.
Of women in order for us to succeed. And so I was already, I think, carrying a little bit of that. But I think I also really had a deep sense that, we, all of us, have to make these hard decisions in our lives about how long we stay within systems, doing good from within, even though the systems are flawed, and at what point we say, I cannot continue to legitimize this system or put my imprimatur on this system. And one of the through lines in the book is one lawyer after another that I interviewed kind of agonizes about these questions of the entire edifice of the constitutional and statutory system under which we live is not super great for women. And it was built to be not super great for women or people of color or immigrants or LGBTQ people. I could go on. So we live in a system, and every woman in this book works within a system that in some sense is the architect of their own failures and losses. And every single woman in this book goes through different versions of saying, Becca Heller at IRAP essentially says, using the master's tools to take down the master's, house, end of story, this is what I got. I'm using the system to try to, better the system. But there are other people who are much more elegiac. Anita Hill so eloquently sort of talks about a system that ground her down, that she continues to try to fix. And so I think that anxiety about how long do I stay, how long do I say this is normal, is, and I love that I'm in DC, because I think I don't know anybody in DC, certainly who was working, anywhere around the government in these years, who didn't have a version of this. And it's super interesting because I know this is a long answer, but I will say after I wrote...
Speak your truth.
Speaking my truth. After I wrote the piece saying, I don't think I can go in the court building and pretend this is okay anymore, I got a flood of letters from constitutional law professors saying, that's how I feel, that's why I'm not teaching con law anymore, now that Justice Kavanaugh is on the court. And I was sick about it. I was like, no, you have to stay. I can quit. I'm just, take me out, put Mark in. He's better than me anyway. But you can't stop teaching con law. We can't have the only people teaching con law be the people who think the system is awesome. And so I really understand what it means to step out and how complicated that is. I think it's visceral, but for me, that was kind of a line I couldn't.
Well, it's I appreciate how you frame that, because that's a tension that many people will understand, and it's certainly a tension that many women will understand, the difficulty of staying in a system and recruiting more people into a system when they've been sexually harassed, when they've been inappropriately touched, when they've been groped, when they've been denied the promotion that they deserved, and yet recruit other people to say, come on in, we need more. I mean, it's a really difficult position to be in. And so you take us through a journey with involving so many women. You know, these are the baby Ruths, as you were talking about. And Sally Yates, the first no. All right, that begins really the conversation in some ways about this journey of women that you cover. And you mentioned meeting her. So tell us about that first no and why you decided that this is the start in some ways for the book.
I mean, I think it was the start for so many of us, right? It was days after the inauguration, and the Women's March, you know, was going on, and we were trying to figure out how to recalibrate being. And then all eyes turned to this woman who's the acting attorney general, who really thought she was going to just kind of skate until Jeff Sessions got confirmed. I think she says in the book, you know, the acting attorney general signs up for long, boozy lunches because nothing happens until the real attorney general is confirmed. And suddenly she finds out in a taxi on the way to the airport, by the way, she had just been in White House counsel's office talking about another matter, and nobody told her the travel ban was coming, and she finds out in a cab on her phone, reading it in the New York Times like the rest of us, that, oh, by the way, they've just passed this travel ban. And she, you know, kind of goes through the process of explaining almost exactly what you and I just talked about. You know, what do I do? How do I put the imprimatur of the Justice Department? How do I send DOJ lawyers out to defend something I believe to be, first of all, you know, in violation of both the Constitution and statutes, but also to defend something that in her mind is Jim Crow, in her mind is so packed with anti-Muslim animus.
Explicitly,
she says, you know, you heard everything that the nominee for president said on the campaign trail about what this was. It was a Muslim ban. So she makes the decision, after agonizing and talking to her staff, that she can't support it. And for me, I think I start with her both because we all were just, I think, amazed that someone could do that and do that on a dime and jeopardize, you know, their career at the Justice Department. But also that in hindsight, and I say this at the end of her chapter, so few people did it after. The number of people who said, I cannot do this, is shockingly low compared to the number of people who said, I'm going to go ahead and do it, and then I'm going to write a book, and then I'm going to get super rich, and then I'm going to get a gig on TV. Right. And so for me, she stands out because she's the beginning of a thing that never really continued.
Right. Well, it's also interesting, too, because when you think about the women that you cover, so many of them stayed in the trenches, and it wasn't, let me not do my role and let me write a book about the behind-the-scenes trauma, but never having stand up or stood up, right? And you have a lot of standing up, including in Charlottesville with Robbie Kaplan. And you were there. So you're at these hot spots. What is it? You know, it takes you to these hot spots.
I was the Where's Waldo of like
exactly.
horrible things that happened in 2017. That was just, yes. I was in Charlottesville. I had lived there for 18 years. And that was when the neo-Nazis and the white supremacists marched. That was my synagogue. That was my streets. That was our parking lots. My kids, right or wrong, went to preschool right where the Confederate statues were. So they're
hard to avoid in many parts of the South, to be clear.
They were hard to avoid, and also my son's preschool teacher just sent me a photo of him like posing in front of here he is in front of you know, one of the two statues that was at issue. So this was our life. And I think Robbie is interesting for a couple of, you know, you all know Robbie Kaplan because she was the person who represented Edie Windsor, and that becomes the case that kind of strikes at the heart of the Defense of Marriage Act, and that becomes the launch pad for Obergefell and marriage equality. So Robbie, I think, you know, we could all say, and I think you could say this about all these women, like, it would have been enough. She could have just stopped at Windsor, and she would have been, in my view, kind of a warrior of legal and social justice. But Robbie is a person who had just started her own boutique law firm just a few weeks before. She had left Paul Weiss. She wanted to do pro bono work. She's sitting in her office with on folding tables. She's got a couple of little baby lawyers with her and some interns, and they're watching Charlottesville on TV over pizza, which is not the food of choice for Nazi viewing. And all of the
not at all
interns are crying, and Robbie just picks up the phone, and actually we had known each other not well then, but she knew I lived there. And she said, if you can find me some plaintiffs, I'm going to come down and do this, because the Justice Department is not going to investigate civil rights violations. They're not going to try to figure out whether or how these people came inciting violence and in fact resulting in death and disfigurement and deep trauma in the community. And she just came down, filed under the KKK Act, which is more or less a statute that she dusted off. It had been used a little bit in the 60s, but she dusted it off and repurposes it. And she's, for me, really interesting because they filed in 2017, and they only just went to trial last November of 2021. And all of their defendants dropped their phones in the toilet rather than turn over their phones. All of the defendants mysteriously couldn't find any record. I mean, this was a misery from start to finish. And by the way, not all of her defendants, some of her defendants, like Chris Cantwell, every time he tweeted, would have a swarm of people threatening her and her family, and Karen Dunn, who brought the suit with her. And she did it quietly, endlessly, sort of meticulously. And then they get this $26 million judgment in November of 2021. And I don't know if people paid attention. I thought it was one of the most important trials of my lifetime. But it's another thing that vindicates justice in the deepest way, and we kind of slide over it.
Why do you think that we slide over it? Because you're right. I mean, at a time in which our gravest threat happens to be white supremacy and nationalism within this country and its various tentacles, whether it's the school shootings and violence, so much of it connects back, the anti-abortion efforts that are also connected to white Christian nationalism that has been so deeply weaponized. And so why is it that just kind of went under the radar? That was huge.
I mean, it's interesting because when January 6th happened, having lived through Charlottesville, it was just Groundhog Day for me. In fact, both of my sons just came downstairs and said, this is Groundhog Day, because we had seen every piece of that, including, a failure to prepare, a deep understanding that law enforcement was going to have to do something meaningful, a failure to adequately prepare for it, and then this sense of complete impunity because we were talking largely about white men. So we can talk about why with almost unfailing accuracy, groupings of white men with guns, are treated with impunity. But I think the deeper question is, and this really is something that I try to probe in the book, we think law means trials. Law doesn't mean trials. Trials are a part of it, but organizing is a part of it, and voting is a part of it, and systems repair is a part of it too. And one of the reasons that the last 3 chapters of the book are all on things like gerrymandering and, one person, one vote and vote suppression is that I think that we have watched too much Law and Order, people. Like, we really think that what happens in courtrooms is the totality of doing justice. And we can win 1 million trials and still lose democracy. And so for me, I think that one of the things that we don't focus on enough, and Mark and I have written 20 billion pieces about systems reform, but I think we have to really focus not just on trials, the chills, the thrills, the Kyle Rittenhouse was happening at the same time. It was riveting, but it's not democracy reform, and it's not actually justice reform. And so for me, I think one of the reasons we slide past things is because the things that really matter aren't nearly as exciting as the expectations.
They seem mundane.
Yeah. of law and order. Yep.
Right. No, one important aspect of this, as you talk about, and as was mentioned in the introduction, 2016 on that frigid early March day, you were inside, I was outside, the arguments, Whole Woman's Health v. Hellerstedt, and you mentioned that as being such a profound moment. Of course, this is before Trump, before the November election. And you frame it as this is important. It's a case that involves two Texas laws that were being challenged. These Texas laws were really abortion ban kind of laws, but just dressed up as not so. One involved just make your clinics look like emergency rooms, which would cost millions of dollars and cause clinics to shut down, and many did. And the other was to require that doctors get admitting privileges at nearby hospitals, even though abortions are incredibly safe and many other procedures had no such requirements. And so this was being challenged, but it was a different court. And you were talking about it was a different court from any time before dealing with questions of reproductive rights because of who was sitting in the court at that time.
Yeah, I mean, I called it the last great day for women in justice in America. I had a fever that day. I was so excited because it was, you have to remember, I mean, Roe was decided by 9 men. And Griswold versus Connecticut was decided by 9 men. And I say in the book, because I think it's hilarious, a fun thing to do is go back and read the transcript of Griswold, because the justices, well-meaning justices, who, by the way, effectuate the right to use contraception in a marriage, won't name the devices that they're talking about because it's embarrassing to them. So they're all like, la, 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 we don't know if we're talking about, we don't know, we don't want to know, nobody names it. And then you get this kind of who's on first, like, nobody knows exactly what's happening. And for me, I mean, and I say this in the book, if you can't name the thing, you shouldn't be regulating it, right? Like, it seems to me a sort of simple lesson of women's bodies that if you're too uncomfortable to say the word IUD, then don't make judgments about it. So nevertheless, we get good outcomes.
Yes.
We get good outcomes. But for me, it's really powerful to sit during Whole Women's Health and see 3 women on the bench. And by the way, and it's funny, somebody played it for me on the radio today. There's this amazing moment where the oral advocate, who's a woman, is trying to talk, and Justice Roberts is going to cut her time off. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg, very Ruth Bader Ginsburg-ishly, says to him, I think you should give her a little bit more time to get to the merits in the gentlest, most ginger, passive-aggressive way. And he's like, counsel can have more time. And you're just like, yes, because, women are getting to talk and they're getting to, engage in this. And the decision, I think, in Whole Women's Health, it doesn't get enough credit. It's written by Justice Breyer, not a woman, but a feminist by every metric. And it's written in a way that punctures the pretext you're talking about. Texas can't keep saying this is to make sure that women are healthy when clearly the only plan is to close clinics. And it is such a deep reckoning with what is really going on, what is pretextual, how we think about medicine, how we think about women, how we think about healthcare. You go back, you read it, you want to cry.
Yeah.
And then it's gone in the blink of an eye. And we're not going to get that back. And so I think for me, my sense of what changed, and this is sort of, the book begins with there and ends on Dobbs, but what changed is that we thought we were so close. We had 3 women on the court, and we had this unbelievably, I think, transcendently feminist opinion by a man. We were getting there, and then we were gone.
And in the journey along the way, before we get to Dobbs, one other aspect, and someone that's covered in the book, that's mentioned, is Bridget Amiri, because we begin to see from that 5-3 decision, because Scalia had died, and so it's 5-3 decision in Whole Woman's Health v. Hellerstedt. And then we begin to see the sort of chip away. Trump, doing what he promised. He said that he would punish women who wanted to have abortions. He would only put on the courts judges, justices who would dismantle Roe v. Wade. He's carrying out his promise, essentially. And then there's Bridget Amiri, who works at the ACLU, and you cover her in the book. Can you tell us just a little bit about that, too, before we get to Dobbs?
Yeah, I mean, this is a case, and Mark Stern and I think we're both obsessed with it at the time because it felt like the canary in the coal mine. And these were migrant teens at the border who were in shelters, and the government had determined that even though this particular young woman had gotten a waiver from the state of Texas, she was allowed to terminate her pregnancy, they wouldn't open the door to let her out of. I mean, quite literally, wouldn't let her.
It's like false imprisonment. I mean, it was just really she did all the things that the government required for her to do.
She did all the things, and there were explicit judicial orders that said open the door, and the government would not do it. And Bridget Amiri litigated this, in the D.C. circuit, and ended up winning en banc on the D.C. circuit. It's an interesting story. Canary in the coal mine story, both because it's a story about women who are being imprisoned so that they cannot effectuate their reproductive rights. It's also a story about Brett Kavanaugh auditioning to be on the Supreme Court because the opinion he wrote in that case was clearly an effort to say, look at me, I'm going to drop all the code words that put me on the list of...
and that put me up high on the list.
So I think maybe, and this is where it intersects with so much of your work, Michele, so much of Dorothy Roberts' work, so much of Peggy Cooper Davis's work, but I think we can learn about where women's reproductive rights are going by looking at Black women. And this is, and migrants, migrant teens who by every other metric should have been allowed to terminate her pregnancy. And so I think this case is important, both because, and by the way, the Justice Department tried to discipline Bridget. I mean, it was unbelievable.
Right.
She had to, for months, hit refresh.
Well, she talked about very recently how much she appreciated you because as the Justice Department went after her, you came out publicly and showed the emperor has no clothes here.
I think Mark and I wrote a piece that she still says, it was the first piece that was written to say, disciplining her would be way beyond any norms or bounds. But I think it's also just a story about look and see what they do when people are locked up. Look and see what they do when people are vulnerable, when they don't have counsel, when they may not speak English, because that's what's coming. And maybe that is the pivot for me to Dobbs, because I think a lot of people woke up at the end of June this year and said, what now? What just happened? This isn't possible. Everyone said this couldn't happen.
But you were saying even at SB 8, we were on there together, Texas, which was the bookend, right? Like a year ago, we were on the line the day in which
when SB 8, that was the Texas vigilante bill. And one of the things that, you sort of ticked off these kind of different valences that are now being blessed. But I think vigilantism is a huge part of this.
Yes.
That one of the things that is not, I think we're not clocking, is sort of empowering vigilantes to determine what the law is and then take it upon themselves to enforce it. And in a sense, Bridget Amiri's story is about, one government official who just decided he was going to save every unborn baby in every shelter. He was, folks will remember, clocking their menstrual cycles.
But you can't even make that up,
No,
really, seriously, someone
He
keeping
was.
track of your menstrual cycle.
Well, you can. It's called
Well,
The
you can,
Handmaid's
because
Tale,
right, exactly.
And it's an excellent book by Margaret Atwood, and you should
Yes.
buy it for your daughters. But I
Yes.
think that and your sons. But I think that what's really important is that all of these cases, every single one of these cases, whether it's Robbie Kaplan and the Nazis, whether it's Bridget Amiri and these migrants, are the present. They are what's happening now. And so I think about this book as this is not ancient history. This is a bunch of people who saw the signs before most of us saw the signs.
And they're all women.
And they're women because I think, and this is the controversial proposition in the book, and we can debate it if we want to, I think women have a special relationship with the law and legal systems and legal structures. That's why Michelle's wearing the T-shirt.
That's right.
The T-shirt that I believe, and I have no empirical proof for this, that women have some sort of muscle memory of the law being used against women. Because we live on this dangerous seam between the law lifting us up, making us safe, making us free, giving us the vote, letting us have credit cards in the 70s, and then tilting over into the law incarcerating us. The law saying women in Alabama have to sit in jail because they would otherwise endanger their pregnancies. We've tilted over from law making us free, from law being the solution, to law being the problem. And my submission, again, I don't know if it's correct, is that women know that in their bones.
That there's something in the cellular memory of that. So we're going to take time for Q&A, but I have to say what that reminds me of, and the fact that your book lifts up Paulie Murray, that it acknowledges what's happening across so many different dimensions of women who live vulnerable lives. Women who, Black and Jewish in Charlottesville, women who are migrants, all of that. And I can't help but think, as you just close that out, is something that I think about sometimes. What must a mother have said the night before the slave auction to her child? That's the cellular memory. How do you say something good that keeps you whole when you're going to be sold off? You'll never see that child again. And somehow you must leave a message with that child that you are whole, that you are valued, that you matter. And at some point, this country will catch up to that. And I think that is the power and beauty of your book.
Oh, thank you. That's a lovely thing to say. I mean, I think we have to sit in the tension of the Constitution, as we said at the beginning, being the author of great discrimination, great hardship, great pain. Anyone who tells you it was perfect from the founding is like, what, Ted Cruz, I guess. And the rest of us know that we had to claw our way into these documents. And, you know, Paulie Murray...
And still do. But I think that the dream, I mean, I start with Paulie Murray, a quote from her, because of course she was also a poet. You're just talking about the dream of freedom. And I think that that's a thing that we can do. We can't give up on the law or the rule of law. I think like the next best thing is, you know, street fighting, and I'm spectacularly bad at street fighting. I've actually never tested that. It may Truth be told, Dahlia.
I may just be like a crazy ninja in a street fight, but I don't think I am. And so I think we have to fight for this thing, this aspirational thing. And every single person in this book comes down ultimately on the side of, I think this thing can lift us all up. I think it can make us all better. And each of them sort of picks up an oar to do that work. But part of the reason I wrote this book is that I think we all have to do that work. It is not for lawsuits. It is not just for judges. It is for every single one of us. And I hate to say this, but I think it's the work of the rest of our lives.
I would agree with that. Please join me in giving a very strong round of applause to my friend, Dahlia Lithwick. We have time for questions, and so we'd like for you to come up to the mic if you're able to, and if you're not able to, I will repeat your question. So for those of you who have questions, please make your way to the microphone.
I'd like you to educate us about stare decisis. If there is a new appointment to the Supreme Court, can we say we've got the votes now, we're going back to Roe v. Wade, or is it more complicated than that?
Well, I think now it's going to be very easy to just go back to whatever one wants to, because I think stare decisis is gone, at least for the purposes of this court. I think one of the things under your question is the assumption that the court's going to change anytime soon. And I fear that we have to be pretty realistic about the fact that, there may be some changes, but we are looking at a relatively young court. And the court that I covered for a very long time didn't change at all for years. Poor Justice Breyer, right, had to be the junior justice who opened the door for 100 years. So I don't think the court is going to change in a way that would allow your sort of hypo to come true. But this is where I make my pitch for, I'm going to just say it, structural court reform, the thing that we all should have been talking about, 6-7 years ago, and that we really, really need to talk about now. I think your scenario where the court kind of reverts to being not just on Roe, by the way, but on guns and on the division between church and state, all of the stuff that has changed.
Environmental
in the blink of an eye,
matters.
environment.
All of that.
All of that, I think, really necessitates major, major structural changes at the court.
So here's a prickly issue as someone's coming up to the microphone, and that is, since you mentioned Justice Breyer and staying on, there are those that said that Ruth Bader Ginsburg stayed on too long. What's your take on that? Or is that an issue that you'd punt on?
No, I don't punt, but I do. I was kind of hoping it wouldn't come up. Because it comes up quite a lot. And especially as a person who sort of tries to posit that Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the hagiography is part of the problem, I think by the same measure, the sort of myopic focus that everything that is wrong in America is her fault alone is part of the same problem, right? She goes from the sole hero who's going to save us to the sole villain who sold us out. I guess I will just say this. My sense of it is, without a doubt, she should have retired when apparently President Obama gently suggested that she retire. But I think that she also believed fundamentally in the thing that I am arguing for today, which is I think she believed that if people cared about the court, if they looked at a court where there had been a vacancy that had been held open for the first time in history for close to a year, and 3 other octogenarians or near octogenarians on the court, and the understanding that the court was the single voting issue, no matter what you cared about as a progressive, the court was the tunnel to that. I think she expected that people would get that. And I think, rightly or wrongly, her feeling was, it's not for me to decide who is on this court. It is for you. And you should therefore go to the polls and pull the lever, even if you hate her, for Hillary Clinton, because the court is going to become exactly the court that it became. So I think
other courts, the lower courts, we can't forget
the lower
right?
courts too. But I think that if you look at the exit polling from 2016, by about a 2-to-1 margin, people who thought the court was the most important voting issue pulled the lever for Donald Trump. So I think that, and I don't think she would say it this way, that we didn't show up for the Supreme Court because she's much too polite, but we kind of didn't show up for the Supreme Court. And so that it's not a wash, doesn't make it okay.
No.
But I think that we, instead of sort of blaming her for her failure to be a prophet about her own health situation and to know that she couldn't hang on for those 2 extra months or that she would become ill again, I think asking ourselves how we failed to be not prophets. Like, you didn't have to be a prophet to know that this was going to be the single most important election for the future of the court. So I'm just going to sort of spread that responsibility around.
Like soft peanut butter.
Like soft peanut butter.
All right, we have another question at the microphone.
Hi. Going back to the issue of court reform, since it got a little applause here, what do you think about Jeff Fisher, who teaches the Supreme Court clinic at Stanford and appears a lot before the court, had what I thought was a very thoughtful article in Politico about term limits for Supreme Court justices. What do you think about that as one of the areas?
I am a huge fan of term limits. I think that very few other courts have lifetime appointments that are unchecked. And I think that the plan that would just sort of rotate through so that every president gets the same number and everyone serves for 18 years, not only would have a balanced court, but I think that you would also have the ability to take the temperature down. Every single nomination would not become, an existential fight to the death. So I have no problem with term limits, but I have to confess I'm willing to go one further and say I actually have no problem with adding seats. And it's taken me a very long time. Mark was there way before I was. But I am a person who now thinks that you cannot continue to say, oh, there are these, unwritten, unenforced rules and norms of, how we conduct ourselves.
Or that it exacerbates kind of a political polarization.
The current situation.
Well, the current situation, but also expanding the courts, that it just might not stop. One of the arguments is that expand now, then
mutually assured destruction.
Exactly right.
Yeah, I mean, that's like saying, I'm not going to defend myself because they're going to punch me in the head. I mean, I just think you have to say it is entirely possible that this will ratchet it up. But I think like laying down on the ground and hoping that they conduct themselves reasonably has not proven to be a recipe for success.
Clap. All right, we've got another question at the microphone, and I'm going to get to a question about Justice now Ketanji Brown Jackson and folks wondering what it means for her to be on the court. But yes, please.
Actually, that's a good prompt for mine. When I'm almost 60 next month. So when I was in college,
Happy birthday.
When I was in college, there were no women on the court. Reagan put Sandra Day O'Connor on the court, and even though he was the worst president until Trump, nonetheless, that was, you could say, a good act. But the sort of the pervasive view when I was in college was, if we get powerful institutions more diverse, right? The presence of women and people of color will itself lead to a more progressive worldview, right? And now we have the most diverse Supreme Court, 2 African Americans, 4 women, right? All still products of intensely elite institutions, maybe with the exception of Comey Barrett. And it's the worst court ever, right? And it's fun to make fun of the Warren Court because they didn't want to say IUD. But do you think there is a progressive man or woman today who wouldn't trade the diversity of this court for that all-white male court until Marshall joined it in a heartbeat?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question, and I think it's actually the answer to what President Obama did with his judgeships was really focus on diversity. It was more important to him to put a court that looked like America, not just on the Supreme Court, but as he filled the federal bench. Diversity was the lodestar for him, much more so than putting, somebody who was as far to the left as, a Scalia or a Thomas or an Alito. So he made a decision, a judgment that diversity mattered more. And I would suggest, I think probably Biden is making some of those decisions too, that we're not seeing, with some exceptions, Biden putting people on the court who are sort of far to the left as the sort of conservative heroes. And there's a lot of structural reasons why there's a timidity to do that, to put sort of the, I remember when Obama tapped Sotomayor, I think it was Sotomayor, might have been Kagan. I was like, put Pam Carlin on the court, put somebody who's a bomb thrower, who's going to just get in there and mix it up and be, but
Who's a brawler.
and who would be kind of a curative to the rightward drift. And I think maybe the answer to your question is, and you're not going to like this, but it's very lawyerly, it's a kind of yes and. I think both values are really important. And I think that it matters more than any of us sometimes is comfortable saying, to have a court that looks like the country, because it has to look like the country to be legitimate. And well, there's lots of ways in which that fails.
So for the purposes of camera, how can it look like the country if they all graduated from Harvard and Yale?
I mean, your point taken, stipulated. I will tell you, because I covered then Judge Sotomayor's confirmation hearing, that there was a line of Latina women, young women, 17, 18-year-old women, snaking out around the building, who would get 5 minutes to sit in that chamber
mattered.
Before they were shooed out. It matters. It matters. But I think I will just say this. I really do believe that part of the problem here is that the dual effort to both have a court that is diverse and an Article 3 bench that is diverse, and also to construct a bench that is as liberal as the courts are conservative, is a project that is at war with each other. There's no question. And I think both values really matter. So one of the things that I think we have to think about is why it's so hard to do that second thing, to put real progressive bomb throwers on the courts, why it's hard for Biden to do that, and why it's was hard for Obama to do that. And I think it really goes to some of the themes I was trying to pull out before about how even we voted in the 2016 election, which is if there is no urgency to center the court as an issue, if we are not pushing, right? I mean, Obama said, hold me to it, hold me to it. And then he put fairly centrist people on the court. So I think that one of the things that we have to do is ask ourselves why we haven't thought about this very much, and why we haven't agitated for it, and why when Biden does put up a Dale Ho, right, he puts up people who are incredibly street brawlers, you know, on voting rights, we're not fighting for them. And so I think, again, I keep saying, you know, the fault is ours, we suck. But I do think this is another one of those issues in which the asymmetry you're describing is an asymmetry that almost perfectly maps onto our own enthusiasm.
Wow. Do we have another question? So we can sneak in one more question.
As a Georgetown Law graduate, I agree with the Harvard and Yale take there. Mark knows what I'm talking
Notre
about.
Dame. You got Notre Dame.
Right. So I'm wondering, Professor Goodwin's latest book was written pre-Dobbs, but obviously a lot of the issues were still, you know, despite Roe still being in place then, they were still prescient, and now even more so. And I'm wondering, thinking about people on the court, we think about how conservatives with Leonard Leo, with Federalist Society, as well as kind of in conjunction with the groundwork. You know, people on the ground, they're, I don't want to say community organizing for them, but conservatives going in, it all seems like kind of part and parcel. And I'm wondering if you see a sort of similar, I guess, coordination among, I don't think ACS has reached Federalist Society levels yet, but among both people at higher rungs of power, of influence, as well as, let's say, like people now who are working for abortion funds, or people at like National Advocates for Pregnant Women who are working on a lot of the issues that you talked about in your book. Do you see that there is kind of this conjunction going on where finally the progressives might have the same sort of coordination that the conservatives have, you know, been so good at? Or is that something that is, you know, still something that progressives really are behind on?
I mean, I'll let you answer the question from your perspective. I will just say I think that the court's lowest approval ratings in the history of polling suggests that there is new energy and enthusiasm to think very hard about the court as you know, as perfect and balls and strikes people. Whether that's translating into action, I mean, it's certainly translating, in my view, if you look at Kansas and Michigan and Alaska, it's translating into registering voters. Whether it's translating into action around court reform or structural change, I'm not sure. I certainly know there are more people talking about structural court reform than there were even a year ago, and that includes, you know, a lot of you know, political actors who, not the president, who doesn't want to talk about it, but I think a lot of political actors who are now very, very seriously saying, you know, we've got to think about term limits, we've got to think about other structural reform. But do you have a sense that it's turning into the kind of action that would be transformational at the courts?
Well, I'll say this because I wanted to end with you, and maybe we'll just end with this poem, part of this poem from Paulie Murray that you have in the book. But let me say this, is that I think at the core, what we've come to understand is that at the core of our struggle and fight for our democracy is the need for us to reckon with our past. and our need to reckon with American slavery, with American Jim Crow, with colonization, and all of that. And until we deal with that forcefully, then sadly we stand the chance of repeating what we've done before. You know, I call this time the new Jane Crow because it looks just like Jim Crow. So with that, Dahlia, would you mind reading this opening to your book from Paulie Murray right here?
Yeah. One of the things the book ends on Stacey Abrams, and I love that she writes romance novels. And truly, one of the reasons it's a pink book, and I say this in the introduction, is because at some point a constitutional law professor who heard about this project said to me, he was a he, by the way, said to me, why are you going to write a little pink book about the law? So then I had to write a big pink book about the law, but I kind of wanted it to be something of a romance novel, something of, a love letter, because I think it for me, it is a love letter. I mean, I'm so in the tank for the rule of law. It's almost sad. And so I end with Stacey Abrams writing romance novels. And I begin with Paulie Murray writing poems. And Paulie Murray's poems are breathtaking. They are. Breathtaking. Yeah. And so this is just one of the two epigraphs. And we've spoken about this before. I don't even know exactly from which place she writes this, but for me it is so of this moment. So it's a snippet of Paulie Murray. Freedom is a dream, haunting as amber wine, or worlds remembered out of time. Not Eden's gate, but freedom lures us down a trail of skulls, where men forever crush the dreamers, never the dream. Paulie Murray from Dark Testament. Chills, right? She's amazing.
Thank you both, Dahlia and